Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita and I'm joined by Bharath. Bharath and I are researchers in technology geopolitics with the Takshashila Institution. Hi Bharath, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi, Shobhankita. Glad to be here and looking forward to the talk.
Yeah. So Bharath has a recent opinion piece with the Indian Express, and we'll link that in the show notes. And essentially, this is on the recent flurry of activity that's been happening on AI restrictions from both US and China, but particularly the one that's been making more of the headlines has been the one coming from the US, and a series of things actually from the US. So I want to just set some context here. So essentially, on June 2nd, the Trump administration signed an executive order. On the face of it, this looks like a cybersecurity order, but also a particular section particularly focuses on frontier models, their deployment, and so on and so forth. So essentially, developers and it was framed when this executive order was signed on June 2nd as a voluntary framework, essentially that developers would voluntarily have to give the federal government 30 days of time to pre-release of a model. After that, the government would help them choose trusted partners for deployment. But given the series of incidents that's happened the few months prior to this order being signed, we know that this is not fully voluntary, in the sense that there is some tension, there is some pressure on the face of it. Because, for example, our viewers and listeners will remember that Anthropic was deemed a supply chain risk and so on, right? So this is not as voluntary as it sounds, because it does come from at a time when there is pressure. And for example, when the supply chain risk designation was sort of put down on Anthropic, right at the time when there was back and forth between the Department of War and this private Silicon Valley company about the terms of use of their models, whether this could be used for mass surveillance, whether this could be used in active war fighting, etc., etc. And when this title was deemed upon them, of course, Anthropic had said that this was not transparent, it was not fair, it was not grounded in technicalities, and yet this seemed to be one kind of a pressure tactic. So, given that that was the context in which this executive order came in early June this year, obviously there was some apprehension, but less than a week later, which is exactly on June 9th, we had the Fable 5 launched. And by June 12th, we had export controls on this technology, which essentially meant that foreign nationals of even the firm's own employees, right? Foreign nationals, as long as that was the primary criteria, they could not have had access to these models. And because Anthropic could not have met that, both Mythos 5 and Fable 5 were pulled out for a while. And by June 26th, Mythos was partially reinstated for specific US trusted party partners, as the government had designated. And today, as we record, which is July 1st, we have both Fable 5 and Mythos 5, is it? Is it both of them, Bharath?
Yeah, both of them, but Fable 5 is available to the public, but Mythos is again to trusted partners only.
Correct. So as we speak, on July 1st, Fable 5 has now been restored globally. So if you just see the back and forth that's happened vis-a-vis access to latest Claude, you see that it's almost like an on-off switch. It's a commercial product. Claude and Anthropic now have millions of users globally, and yet this is a directive that seems to dictate who then has access to it. So this is the confusion, the chaos, and the uncertainty to what seems like the most frontier of AI capability and technology to the rest of us, not US companies and not the US population, that we are essentially trying to tackle in this episode of All Things Policy. Bharat, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I'll just maybe add a couple of things on why Fable and Mythos were withdrawn from the market. So this was following an Amazon report which said that some jailbreaks were identified where users could, using sophisticated prompts, be able to access functionality which was not supposed to be allowed, right? So to explain what Mythos and Fable are, so Mythos and Fable are some of Anthropic's most powerful models. So, and the cybersecurity capabilities of these models far surpass most, even the most skilled cybersecurity researchers, and it matches even the elite researchers, right? So it's able to grant access to identifying or exploiting vulnerabilities in a software program. So this could be used for both defensive and offensive applications, and so that there's some concern about it in the wrong hands. The damage that it could do is, it could be a serious cause for concern, especially towards critical infrastructure and so on. So Mythos is this frontier model, and Fable is kind of Mythos with guardrails. So there's a layer of safeguards that have been built on top of Mythos. So, and if there is some sense that the user is trying to access capabilities for any kind of purpose which are not seen as benign, so the Fable model automatically downgrades it and uses a less powerful model instead of using Mythos, right? So that's in a broad sense what's going on here. So these were released at some point of time, and then Amazon pointed out that there's a way in which you could jailbreak this to get access to these advanced capabilities for doing, say, offensive applications as well. And because of that, there was an executive, I mean, there was an order to take these off the market. And that's when there was a lot of concern amongst a lot of countries or users in across the world, saying that if they can't rely on access to these models, then it's a more serious call for developing sovereign capabilities, and you every country needs to have access to this in some form, right? So that was where the conversation was also in response, going in response to these kind of actions. So this is some context. Now, going back a little bit to the executive order that you mentioned, so that came out on June 2nd, and it's titled as Promoting Advanced AI and AI Innovation and Security. And some parts of it actually set out what looks like a licensing framework. So there is something, a threshold that's been set for models with which need to have controlled access, and it's all voluntary, voluntary in quotes, but then you need to clear these thresholds. You need to, someone has to certify you, and if that you are certified, I mean, then you get access to, say, these trusted this group of vendors that you can sell to, right? So even though it's all voluntary, because you have to go through this process to get access to those trusted partners, maybe there is some tendency for this voluntary to become a de facto mandatory framework, but because you're complying just so that you can get access to the trusted partner network and so on. So there's some concern there, but all of this is going on in the background. This is not specifically what led to Anthropic and Mythos being withdrawn from the market. That was a different order, but all of this is going on more or less at the same time. So it gives you some context of what kind of thinking is driving the decision making and the policy process around frontier AI. So yeah, that's kind of just the background. So we can go on from there now.
Yeah, and just one thing to add there is it's not like the frontier AI companies are happy about this. They themselves have expressed sort of concern because obviously it restricts their user base and potential for revenue as well, right? So it makes sense that this is something that they would, in their limited negotiating leverage here against the Commerce Department or the Department of War or the powers from the Trump administration that may be. For example, when OpenAI's 5.6, the GPT 5.6 was restricted and was first open to 20 partners, OpenAI itself said that this kind of government access process should not become the long-term default. They said it should only be a short-term step. So clearly, there seems to be also consensus, at least from the companies, that they would like this to be not the way it is.
If I can just add something here, but when you look at this executive order, there's a clear sense of the priorities that are driving this. Because if you look at all of the organizations that are in charge, have the responsibility of framing the licensing framework or setting these rules and all of that, you see that there's a lot of national security establishment presence here. So you see the NSA, you see the National Security Agency, you see the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. So all of these, the Secretary of War, the National Cyber Director, so all of them have a more prominent role in how this has been framed and how this will be implemented, right? So it kind of gives you the direction in which the priorities are being decided and by whom as well. So.
Correct. I think that's a good time to talk about the narrative with which frontier AI capabilities today are even being framed. Because I think it's this national security narrative, almost like a maximalist approach that seems to be driving just who gets access to technology, how these technologies need to be governed, and who governs it. Like you were saying, the specific departments that are involved. And while this is all about the US, we also see where China, for example, seem to show the same kind of approach vis-a-vis their travel ban. So firstly, this seems to be about an arms race, when actually we at Takshashila look at it not so much as an arms race, or that this particular arms race framing is a little out of touch with the realities of the technology in itself. But clearly, under the national security halo between US-China tech competition, that seems to be missing. So first, Bharath, maybe set some context with the Chinese travel ban and also this framing that you write about.
So if you look at it as an arms race, right? So it's basically a zero-sum game. There's only one winner, and the winner takes all, and because the winner takes all, and this idea that AI is progressing so rapidly that at some point it's going to become super intelligent. So there's going to be a really powerful system, and once you reach that point, whoever reaches that point first will be able to make a faster progress than the rest, and basically it's a race to get to that point. So speed in that sense matters over building guardrails or adopting it responsibly, and essentially, if you are looking at it from this kind of a framing, then it makes sense to slow down your adversary, put export controls on them, deny them access to the building blocks of these systems, and so on. Right? So all of the things that you have seen being deployed. So the US, for example, has imposed export controls on chips. They were considering 3 tiers of access for access to the advanced AI chips. So one with free access to, or the most trusted partners of the US who would have free access, and a second tier where they would have limited access, and a third tier where they would be banned from access to these things. So that was reverted and that didn't go through. But these were all the things that have been considered. And even now there are some restrictions on chips, and restrictions on talent, restrictions on the movement of capital. And you see all of these kind of align with this framing. Now, this framing might not be the best to explain AI, is what we at Takshashila think, because AI is not something like a nuclear weapon which has certain inputs which are very rare and not easy to get, and it's really hard to build that technology. But the way AI is being built is just there are a lot of people involved, so it's easy to diffuse, easy for that knowledge that is contained within these. That these people has been published in different papers, and these people move across companies, so that knowledge transfer also happens. So it's hard to contain it in that sense, and it's also not a single entity or a country competing with another country. It's different stakeholders, different players across the globe, competing and collaborating with each other. So it might be a US company competing with a Chinese company, but also with another US company, but also collaborating with some Chinese companies, right? So you see selective collaboration and competition across borders and within borders, and that makes it really complex. So the kind of instruments that you would use in this kind of a situation is not something that you can use to say closely treat it as a secret, and you don't allow that to go outside the borders, right? So that kind of an instrument might not be the best in this situation is what we think. And you see that it's not been very effective either. So we've seen that there have been export controls on chips, but then there have been ways in which companies have been able to get access to those chips, maybe having data centers in Malaysia, and those data centers being used to train models. And even if so, it's a cat and mouse game where you're trying to come up with a regulation, someone finds a way to bypass that, and then you try to plug in those loopholes, and it's just this kind of a thing that's going on. And even in the long term, is it really the kind of ecosystem that you want, where you have a Chinese and a US led divergence in these two technology systems, where you have Chinese companies making different. It gives Chinese companies basically more of an incentive to develop their own chips to, build more resilience in the long term, right? So, and it also raises costs for everybody. So we look at it as more of a geopolitical innovation race in that sense. So there's selective cooperation and collaboration across borders, and the so you see states trying to incentivize through industrial policy some level of domestic capabilities, or to find national champions, but also there is collaboration competition. So Nvidia would like to sell chips, for example, to Chinese companies, but they have been denied from doing that. So you see that the incentives are at conflict in this kind of a thing, and it cannot be clearly aligned with an arms race kind of a framing. So that's one kind of way to look at it. A completely different way to look at it is that this is not a typical arms race, it is maybe an innovation race, but there's also this idea that it's not who invents it first that matters, but how effectively can you diffuse that technology across society. And in that sense, it's comparable to electricity. So it doesn't matter who invented it first, but how effectively are you able to leverage this technology to improve productivity across sectors, right? So, and across the country. So how effectively, when you apply it to AI, how effectively can you say build applications on top of it? How effectively can the society at large adopt it, or see some kind of a benefit from it? So all of that depends not on just inventing it first, but building use cases in that apply to a local context, that address daily needs, and so on, right? So all of these, and multiple of these exist at the same time. So you might want access to the frontier capabilities, maybe a cybersecurity model that can defend you against attacks, but you also want to diffuse it to address everyday use cases, like say translating it to a regional language, some content, or having a healthcare, a first kind of an interface, a first pass evaluation kind of a healthcare system that can make healthcare accessible more widely. So all of this is true at the same time. So you can't maybe restrict yourself to one box, but you can see how multiple of these are competing in some sense.
Correct. And maybe just to give an example from India's own use of digital public infrastructure, right? We didn't come up, we didn't have to invent QR codes for the fintech industry to take off. But it was the combination of Aadhaar, which was biometrics, and zero bank balance accounts, combined with this QR codes, which eventually led to the rise of the fintech sector in India to the extent that we see today. So it's the adoption, especially for a population like India. I think the diffusion has multifold impacts that actually help with our prosperity, with our own population's potential for growth, incomes, etc., which are not being captured when you just frame it as an arms race.
Yeah, I agree with that. So it's a lot of the gains that we've had from DPI also. You see that it's more of building some infrastructure on which a lot of other innovation is able to happen, right? So building those rails is something that that has enabled all of that to happen.
Correct. So anyway, just stepping back, right? So we have these licensing machinery, which at least quote unquote is voluntary, but it may potentially become mandatory or at least de facto mandatory. And in either case, we see this on and off approach where right now it's open for all of us to access, but we don't know if that will necessarily remain so or will change. So, what does this mean for India, especially if we were to depend on one nationally controlled closed source model, right? Because that is a dependency that is vulnerable. So, particularly for India, where obviously we understand that the adoption of this technology can have all of these manifold impact, which are positive. How does this environment in which access can be restricted and pretty much with a directive that may or may not be fully thought through, the consequences of it, I mean, the back and forth in this seems to indicate that it's not fully thought through, right? So what does that leave us with?
So I think there is enough maybe thought going on, but it might not always be discussed in the public domain. So we might not be aware of the concerns and how it's been addressed in response to those concerns. So, for example, we know that just yesterday, Anthropic has published a report of how they have addressed these concerns that were raised when and that led to their models being withdrawn from the market. So they have come up with a lot of safeguards. Some of them include, these classifiers that restrict access to their models if they suspect any kind of attempt to jailbreak their models. So those classifiers have been made deliberately more to be more safer in the sense that they try to restrict even with the slight suspicion that someone is trying to attempt something malicious. So a lot of efforts have gone into building these classifiers to detect any attempts at jailbreaking, to even define industry standard for what a jailbreak would look like and how do you maybe address that. So a lot of attempts are being made. So I guess a reason why you see this constant back and forth is because, at least in the US, there's not been a focus on building a safety framework. So it's largely been build fast and innovate, stay at the frontier, and that has been the priority for most of the past few years. And some of those guardrails that were supposed to be introduced also have been rolled back. So it's kind of so you see that this back and forth has been maybe because that regulatory capacity has not been built up in over the past few years, that it's seen as going back and forth on this topic. But what does that mean for other countries? I guess you see a call for building domestic capabilities, but I don't know if that's really justified because for a lot of countries, those efforts could be better utilized in other areas. So, and in a sense, maybe the contest between US and China is good for a lot of other countries in the sense that because of this competition, there are open weight models available from both countries, from companies in both countries. So you see that because there's a trust deficit for companies, I mean, models of Chinese companies being adopted globally, a lot of them have been released as open models, open weight models. Basically, that means that you can take the weights of that model, run it on your own servers, and you're able to have, so nobody can maybe restrict access to that model. Maybe future models might not be open, but at least for that model, you're able to run it on your own and so on. There are, again, concerns whether there have some Chinese characteristics embedded in these models because of the data that it's been trained on and the way it's been trained and fine-tuned and so on. So those concerns are there. But in a lot of cases, it's still okay because maybe coding with Chinese characteristics is not too bad. So you see that because of this competition between US and China, you have more companies building these things, more companies releasing these models as open weight or open source models. And that's a net positive for anyone building downstream, because it brings down the costs, it increases competition, and all of those are positive in a sense. So does India need to really invest in building another frontier model because Mythos or Fable is being restricted? I don't know. So there are incentives for US also to gain a global market. So there are incentives for them to enable access to Indian companies and Indian use cases as well. So maybe the priority is to focus on diffusion from an Indian perspective. How can you make it work better in the Indian context, better in Indian languages, better for Indian use cases, and so on, right? So all of these could have more tangible benefits or returns on the capital that's been spent. So that's one way, at least from a tech perspective, that you could think of. And again, focusing more on open models and open ecosystem would again be something that could have benefits here.
Yeah. And in any case, I think a maximalist approach to tech sovereignty, which sometimes gets conflated with self sufficiency, that everything needs to be full stack and indigenous, may not be practical or possible, at least in the immediate term, right? And in any case, in technologies like this, with multiple supply chains that are across the world, maybe plurilateral engagements and resilience through plurilateral diplomatic partnerships is a more feasible pathway.
Of course, I think we always tend to look at, okay, Indians have been denied access to this technology, but we're not alone in this. So there are a lot of other countries which are thinking on similar lines and looking at how to build autonomy or some resilience in how they have access to their tech ecosystem. So plurilateral partnerships are definitely something that we should look at as well. So Europe, or maybe Japan, South Korea, Australia, even the US, all of these, we are in some sort of technology partnerships with these countries already, and we should look at strengthening that. And there are aligned interests in a lot of areas. So there's a lot of mutual benefit that makes a strong case for something like this.
Yeah. Bharath, I also know that you had worked on some draft comments for the judicial AI guidelines. Do you want to maybe draw from some learnings or some recommendations from there that may be relevant to this context?
Again, when we're looking at diffusion, so diffusion has a lot of is how effectively or how quickly you're able to adopt it for different use cases in different sectors across the society, right? And so the Supreme Court had published this draft AI guidelines for AI adoption in courts, and it was something that was unusual in a couple of different ways. So I think it's not often that you see Supreme Court asking for comments on guidelines that they're published. So that was something different. And secondly, it was an opportunity-based framing in which they're looking at AI adoption. So they're looking at how they can leverage it to increase their capabilities, to address the backlog that they have, and to enable a lot of bridge those gaps that wherever they exist. So there's a big kind of an opportunity framing, and they've clearly defined who is accountable, what kind of things are allowed and what's not. In a lot of caseload management and all of these things, they're very optimistic about AI being beneficial over there. But in things like passing a judgment, they still want human. In all of these things, they want the human as the sole person accountable for whatever decision has been taken, with or without the assistance of AI. So, but again, so the idea that it is looking at it as an opportunity instead of saying that no, this is something that we do not want in our courts, is something that enables diffusion. So that kind of framing is something that we should see as in other sectors as well, and looking at it as an opportunity and how you can leverage some of the gains is something in a responsible way, while taking different inputs from stakeholders and building those necessary checks and balances, right? So how do you do that is something that's useful to have, and this is a step in that direction in at least one of those sectors.
Yeah. No, thanks for this, Bharath. I think the framing is very important. I think we've been talking about this as a framing around innovation policy, around this being a general purpose technology, not equivalent to nuclear fissile material and so on and so forth, right? So eventually the winners of technologies like these are those that use it best. And I think in environments like this where access can be restricted, I think as long as you have some asymmetric leverage to not be switched off from the technology when push comes to shove is a strategy around resilience. And that's important. But eventually, the winners will be those who can best diffuse it across their economy and gain manifold from its deployment.
Yeah, definitely, and even outside of the technology stack and looking at open source and diffusion and all of that, there are other things which are equally important as well. So Ajay Shah and Siddharth Raman have an article in Business Standard, where an op-ed in the Business Standard, where they look into some of these things, and they're doing so also in the context of mythos and fable and the restrictions on access and all of these things. So their suggestions also focus on how do you think better about innovation policy? How do you strengthen the innovation ecosystem in our universities so that the next kind of a breakthrough can come out of India? And also reducing the friction for access to buying the infrastructure for frontier technologies, whether it's servers or the chips or IT equipment. So all of these things, whether it's payments or cross-border purchases. So it needs financial reforms. And how do you bring about all of these things so that anyone building from India is able to compete at the same, has access to some of the funding and is able to compete on this in some sort of a level playing field of sorts, right? So those are again reforms that should be considered, and that could enable diffusion in a much broader sense.
Correct. Yeah. Thanks so much, Bharath. And we'll see our listeners in the next episode of All Things Policy. Thanks so much.
Right. Thank you. Thanks everyone for this conversation, and thanks Shobhankita for this conversation. Thank you for listening in.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.